Chris Claremont's classic X-Men tale of a beloved friend going foe gets a big budget do-over, but does the Fox X series go out with a whimper or a bang? Find out when Johnnie Torch reviews X-Men Dark Phoenix. Well, welcome everyone once again to another Johnnie Torch Live broadcast. Johnnie Torch Live number 157. We're doing this one on tape, so to speak, on a lovely Sunday afternoon. The Phoenix Saga, of course, one of the great comic book classics, of course, written by uh, Chris Claremont. And Claremont actually had a cameo in the film. I didn't see him, but I kind of felt that they probably were going to give him one since he had one, I think, in Days of Future Past. But we're going to go deep into spoilers on Dark Phoenix. Let me just give some brief spoiler-free thoughts. My initial reaction I posted on Twitter was what this film is the textbook definition of a mixed bag. There are moments of inspiration coupled with moments of amateurish uh, work. It's very, very scattershot. There's moments of retread, yet there's moments of, you know, sheer wonder. It's very lopsided in its being put together, and it's difficult to talk about without getting into spoilers because the film did keep a lot of its story under wraps. um I'll try to say without spoiling, Jessica Chastain's character was probably the low point of the film, but there are some great performances here. Particularly the actors in this image I've got on screen were very, very, I would say, brilliant in their performance. I think McAvoy had less to do here than in any of the other X films. He didn't really have too much heavy lifting to do. He made the best of what he could out of it, but for the most part, the acting is phenomenal. So if you want to see it on that basis alone, you wouldn't be wrong. Story-wise, like I said, it's part retread, part ambitious. Without going too much into it, I would say if you're a longtime fan of the franchise, of either the Fox franchise or the X-Men in general, you would want to check this out. I think it's worth your time, but mm, I think I would still say this is not the worst by any means, not the worst Fox X film. Uh, a lot of people would say Origins, Wolverine Origins was worse. I don't particularly hate that film. I do think that Apocalypse, which is probably my least favorite film, is still my least favorite X film. I think this was, I would say, by far and away better than Apocalypse. But we'll get into all of that in just a moment. So, spoiler warning: we're going to go really deep into Dark Phoenix, the X-Men extravaganza. Okay, so let's see. As we start off here, we have basically. It seemed to me like Simon Kinberg, who is the writer-director here, basically took his old script for The Last Stand and cut out the Cure portions, which probably weren't his anyway. Didn't they have like about 3 different writers on Last Stand? And he just punched up a little more of the Dark Phoenix stuff, which is good, but he didn't really delve into the comic origins, which we all knew pretty much from the beginning. They said there was going to be no Lilandra, there was going to be no Shi'ar Empire. So this doesn't come as a huge surprise, but uh, there was a way to delve deeper into the Dark Phoenix lore without going there, so long as they really brought out something more in the Dark Phoenix that we didn't see already. That's kind of where the retread comes in, where we still have some pretty strong beat for beat moments in this film that are almost exactly the same as The Last Stand. Again, so this project, again, just to give a brief overview, this project was troubled from the beginning. There was a delayed release It was supposed to come out last year, I believe in August, and rewrites were done and reshooting was done, and it was supposed to come out in February. And then I think the edict came down from Disney because of, I don't know, possibly because Endgame was out, and of course the merger had already happened at this point, where Disney was calling the shots on whatever was going on with Fox. So the film was then moved from February to now in June. I think there could be some fault with Disney for wanting to monkey around with this film. I'm not going to try to make a, some kind of maniacal plot against this film, but I do think that corporate must have monkeyed around with this a little bit. I hear that the ending of the film was reshot to give it a different ending because it was too close to another film. The common sense rationale people are saying is Captain Marvel, although I really don't see what they would have done in this film that could have resembled Captain Marvel. All that happened was Captain Marvel smashing through ships and stuff. I hardly would think they would have called that a, you know, aping the Captain Marvel ending. But in any case, Simon Kinberg, a untested director, he hadn't done very much before this project in terms of direction, and of course, the onus is on him. He doesn't quite deliver. But let's go into the story at large here now. We're going to go probably about an hour, and we'll get into the details here. We start off with Jean Grey in the back of her parents' car in the mid 70s. Not quite unlike what we had in The Last Stand. We see Jean's first manifestation of her powers. In this case, she doesn't want to hear Glenn Campbell's "By the Time I Get to Phoenix," which I didn't catch that until after the film was over. And I thought, oh, that's clever. That's clever. By the time I get to Phoenix, and Jean doesn't want to hear it. So, that was pretty cool. I got to give them props for that. And she's changing the radio dial, and eventually she ends up. It's not very clear, but I guess in some respects she causes her mother to pass out and causes a car crash, killing her mother. And we think at that point her father as well. She gets brought in by Professor X to the School for the Gifted, and he promises her that he'll be able to train her how to use her powers, and it's up to her what she does with those powers. He's not going to influence her in any way or, manipulate her in any way. Now, again, we're going to try to do this linearly, but trying to mix the good and the bad. I think one of the first bad points that I'm going to point out is Professor X in this film. As I said, James McAvoy, and I've said this before, is phenomenal. I think he should have gotten an Academy Award for Days of Future Past. He has been nothing short of phenomenal in these films. He's given very little to do here. As I said, in terms of heavy lifting, I mean, he is giving as good a performance as the material allows him, but they do a real character job on Charles this time. It's basically the same as what they did to him in The Last Stand, where he has to put psychic blocks into Jean's conscious psyche so that she will not be traumatized by the event of her parents' death. And in the Last Stand, it's to suppress a dual personality. In both cases, it seems like, and I think perhaps in The Last Stand, they give him a little more credit for taking a difficult choice upon himself and doing the best he can to protect someone that's in his charge. So it doesn't really feel as earned as that the vitriol against him doesn't seem earned in either film. I think they get away with it perhaps a little more here because they added the element of her father still being alive. and that her father basically wanted nothing more to do with her and just shipped her off to Xavier, and Xavier never tells her this. And when she finds out, of course, it turns the relationship even more sour than it could have already been. It just feels like it goes completely against the Charles and Jean relationship. It didn't work in The Last Stand, and I don't know why they tried to use that again here. It's funny how certain beats and even certain lines are practically aped from the original script. I don't know why they chose to bring Kinberg back to redo the story. If you're going to redo the story, you don't want to have necessarily the exact same framework, particularly if you're going to try to supposedly do it more accurate to the comic. But instead, it looks like I said, Kinberg basically just took his original story and tried to punch it up a little, and at least thought to himself, this is a better product because I put a slightly different spin on it, and people will be able to embrace it better. Because Last Stand is generally disregarded by the fans at large. Me, I particularly don't have a problem with the film. Again, it's not the strongest film because there were certain things they could have done better, but I don't dislike it in the least. Uh, it's slightly weaker, maybe even flawed, but not a bad film. I would say the same here. If we were to compare Last Stand and Dark Phoenix, I think Last Stand is a better overall narrative. It tells a better story more clearly, more concisely. On the other hand, where Dark Phoenix excels over The Last Stand is The Last Stand had too much cluttering it up. It had the Cure storyline. We had to deal with how we're going to write out Charles and Scott and so forth. This basically sticks to the story. We don't have to go off on a rabbit trail on different things. It sticks very closely. And that is another reason why I say it's better than Apocalypse, because Apocalypse, it went off on a lot of different tangents. There was a lot of stuff going on. This doesn't really quite have that problem. It distills the story down to its basic essentials, which is the Dark Phoenix and Jean's struggle within. I think the Dark Phoenix scenes or the elements of the Dark Phoenix are much stronger in this film too. That's not to take anything away from Famke Janssen, who did, a great job with what she was given. But essentially, that film, Last Stand, forgets about Dark Phoenix for large portions of it, where she's basically just standing there as a war is going on, and people have commented about, you know, this sort of by necessity having to sideline her in much of that film. And in this case, the focus is very much on Jean, and there really isn't any badly written contrivances to put her out of it. I'm going to talk about that in a few minutes. That's the good that we're going to talk about, but we're still kind of talking about the negative aspects. All right, let's talk a little bit, since we're in the negatives. Let's talk about the obvious problem of the time jumps. I don't really understand why they're jumping 10 years. It seemed like a novel approach at first, where you have Mystique and Beast as the only original members of the team still around. And you can kind of get away with that because obviously Beast looks like Beast and he's just using some kind of formula or something to make him look human again, which I guess would probably make him look young. I can get past that. Same with Mystique. She can look like whatever she wants. No problem. Charles and Eric, over the past three films, the films came out like over, I don't know, 8 years or so, and they barely look like they've aged when they've really aged film wise 30 years, which leads to a a humorous meme that I've been seeing online of, take a look at Charles, how he's aged. He's 62 years old in this film. Obviously, being a Holocaust survivor, he really shouldn't be in 1992 looking like he's barely 40. And, again, that's kind of things that you can kind of, wink your eye at and be like, oh, okay, I get it. But it's very strange they decided to do this. particularly to set this film in 92 when there is honestly nothing in this film that has the trappings of the 90s. I mean, they don't play, Nirvana, they don't do any of the things that they kind of tried to do in Captain Marvel. There is really literally nothing. I won't say nothing. There is one thing that recalls the 90s that I noticed, which was um, Professor X using a rotary phone, a desk phone, an old style telephone. Apart from that, there was really nothing to betray the time period. And so to have Magneto now be pushing 60, to have Jean and Cyclops be, I don't know, allegedly they would be like maybe 28, 27 or something in this film, and they obviously don't look like they've aged a day. It is kind of, unnecessary to put that on the film. I don't really know why they decided to do it. Again, it was a novel approach at first because you put the X-Men on the beach in the Cuban Missile Crisis, then during the Paris Peace Accords or whatever in Vietnam. But then when it came to like the 80s and 90s, there really isn't a whole lot of reason to stretch out the timeline that far. Of course, if you're looking for continuity, Fox never cared about continuity, so I'm not going to go crazy about that. I do think that another problem of the time jumps is, for example, there's a lot of places where there should have been exposition in this film where there really wasn't. Now, the X-Men are pretty much accepted at this point in history, and that is carrying on with the narrative. After Mystique saved, Trask or whatever, and saved the president, mutants were looked upon highly. That's a theme that goes through the 80s and Apocalypse. But now in the 90s, Professor X is being called upon to uh, send out the X-Men as if they're a military division. And kind of the reason for this is there is not enough exposition to really explain how these things came about. The biggest problem being Magneto. Now, last we seen Magneto in Apocalypse, he sort of parted on amicable terms with Charles, and he just sort of went off to do his thing because they basically saved the planet from a, despot. And what we learn in this film is that in the past 10 years, once again, Magneto has been living the quiet life, and he's now a leader of his own, well, I don't know if it's his own country so as much as a land that was ceded to him by the government for his own use as a reservation for mutants. Genosha is what it was called in the comics. I don't know if that's what's called here. I obviously don't remember because there really wasn't enough explanation about it. And it is sort of it's very strange because it's again the contrivance of the time jumps make it that Magneto doesn't do anything for 10 years. In the first film between First Class and Days of Future Past, Magneto's in prison, and that's the only way you keep him from causing trouble because he was suspected of assassinating JFK. Then between Days of Future Past and Apocalypse, he settles down to the quiet life, which is something that I found very out of character for Magneto, and that's another reason why I think that film was a little lacking. And then, of course, he gets pressed back into service. Here, it's a little bit more believable that he's willing to let the past go as long as mutants are being treated fairly, and he's got his own plantation to work and crop and whatever and build on. So again, it's the time jumps that makes these things contrived. Magneto's quiet for 10 years, then he comes back. Then he's quiet for another 10 years, then he comes back. It's kind of strange. All right, another criticism I had of this film, since we're going to stick to the criticism for a while, is it's not long enough. This is the same problem they had with The Last Stand, where you have the most epic, arguably the most epic X-Men story, or I would say comic book tale in general, is the Phoenix slash Dark Phoenix saga. It's one of the most epic stories in comics. And both films have a runtime that's like under 2 hours. I think this one was. I think without credits, both films are about an hour and 45 minutes. And with Apocalypse, it, I can't remember exactly the runtime. I think it's 144 minutes. They could have trimmed out about 25 minutes of that film, and it would probably be better for it. And here in this case, it doesn't quite get the epic treatment. They trimmed it down and tried to tell an epic story, about the time of a made-for-TV movie. And at certain points, this film does feel like a made-for-TV movie. We're going to get to that in a second as well. Uh, I don't have a problem though with the special effects. I've seen a lot of reviewers saying how the CGI was terrible. I didn't see that. Again, I might be just easily satisfied with CGI. I didn't see. I mean, there might have been one or two scenes that effects that looked a little off, but to bash the film for CGI, it seemed like the effects were good to me. But again, it did feel very like Sci-Fi Channel-ish at times. It was like we're trying to get this big epic story down into an hour and 25 minutes, taking out commercial time. And that's kind of the problem. You really can't do this kind of story and build on it without giving us the full experience, giving us the full exposure of everything the Dark Phoenix does. Instead, it's very brief vignettes that go from scene to scene. Um, Again, let's get back to the overall story. So Charles sends the X-Men out into space to save a spacecraft that the astronauts are in danger. This, of course, does harken back to the comic. It's one of the few times they really go back to the comic, and instead of the Last Stand, Jean ends up getting bombarded with the nebula cloud that's out there, and gets the power of the Phoenix. Of course, this is slightly contradictory to the ending of Apocalypse, where she did already have the Phoenix power within her. That to me is more a mistake of Apocalypse than it is Dark Phoenix, because she wasn't supposed to have been born with the Phoenix power. She was supposed to actually get it in this uh, scenario. Uh, Talking about the characters for a second, because I just want to spotlight on Quicksilver. This is basically his only scene in the movie. And it's understandable because when you have a character that's that fast, it's almost impossible to write them where they're not a deus ex machina where they can solve every problem. So it's like poor Quicksilver gets his leg broken in every film. And that happens later on, but this is like his moment in the movie. He doesn't get another sweet dreams moment. He doesn't get another if I could save time in a bottle moment. He just zips around and grabs the astronauts for Nightcrawler. Kind of disappointing that they couldn't utilize him more. He did get a funny line though, because he is probably the most humorous character, where he's in the school and he's saying, Gene did a little. I did most of the work." And that was hilarious. Again, not a whole lot of laughs in this film, but its subject matter kind of demanded a more darker treatment, and I think they could have gone a little bit darker still, but they don't, and we'll get into that in a second too. So this sets up the relationship also between we have another continuity issue. Correct me if I'm wrong, but Nightcrawler needed a space helmet, and for some reason Pietro and Jean didn't. I don't know. I mean, they could have explained that as well. There's not really any exposition in this film. Things just happen that you have to take it that either you're going to assign a reason to it for your own edification, or you just accept it. But so we are already set up with the fact that Cyclops and Jean are now a couple. Mystique is sort of now playing the mother hen role to these younger X-Men. Beast is sort of like the uncle. And again, they haven't aged really, but Mystique wants to leave the team. Beast doesn't want her to. And again, let's spotlight Jennifer Lawrence for a minute here. She's like an object of contention, sort of, in the Fox films. I don't really see a problem with her in the first two films, First Class and Days of Future Past. She was fantastic. There was no real problems. In Apocalypse, you could tell she was not happy with playing Mystique. She just did not want to wear the blue makeup and stuff. And in this film, I don't really feel that she didn't want to be there. I felt like she was giving it her all. So if people are going to put it on J-Law that she didn't really want to do this, I think she wanted to come back, and I think they did. She's wearing the costume, the X-Men uniform, which the X-Men uniforms look great here. It goes back to sort of the first class suits, which were the best suits, and she has the blue makeup on, the blue face makeup at least a, about half the time, maybe slightly more than half the time. So I really can't diss her in this movie. She doesn't have a very big part to play either. You can tell though that she did take the part expecting to be killed off, wanting to be killed off, and that's pretty much what her role entails. That uh, she ends up dying. So again, the Phoenix Force ends up manifesting in Jean. We get the cameo of Dazzler here, which originally she was supposed to be played by Taylor Swift, if I remember correctly. This actress is not Taylor Swift. Again, she does some kind of brief. And she looked very much like Dazzler. It wasn't something you had to try very hard to, recognize. I'm happy about that. She had the usual jumpsuit on and the makeup on the eyes and so forth. She was singing something that was very decidedly un-90s as well. I don't know what the heck that was she was singing, but again, that didn't really seem like it was necessarily screaming out 90s. And so her powers become manifest at this party, this gathering out in the woods. She ends up having this psychic episode, and Professor X tries to reach into her mind once again to try to assess the damage and repair whatever mental blocks he put in her mind. And this again, this kind of goes flying in the face of what we've seen between their relationship in Apocalypse, where it seems like they are determined to put the blame on Professor X that he's done some terrible thing to Jean by trying to prevent, you know, these traumatic experiences from damaging her psyche. So she goes off to find her father because she finds out that her father is still alive. And, it's a tense scene because I think the father knows that she's dangerous and doesn't really want to be around her. And eventually, of course, the mood swing, so to speak, turns and she gets very agitated. She doesn't kill him. And then again, sort of aping the last stand, the X-Men arrive to save the day and to try to bring Jean back. Again, this is the core of the Dark Phoenix storyline. This is, you know, the heartbreak of a best friend that turns foe. And they turn foe against their own will. Jean doesn't want to be manipulated by the Dark Phoenix. So this is kind of the elements that do work, even though this is kind of a retread. It does work that they try to bring her back. She ends up still flipping out. As I said, Quicksilver gets injured in his attempt to stop her. He's taken out for the rest of the movie. In an interesting turn, Beast is going to try to tase her, which probably wouldn't do anything anyway. But Charles decides to stop him so that um, Mystique can sort of reason with her. And of course, in a moment of lashing out yet again, her powers lash out and Mystique is killed. So this kind of to me was a slightly better reasoning um for the animosity towards Charles, because he does make that conscious choice where he's going to try to stop Beast from incapacitating Jean because he wants to reach her rather than, and I think that's a very Charles thing. I think that's something Professor X would do. He would try to reach the person without just trying to incapacitate them. But his choice has a devastating consequence, and of course Mystique is killed, and this devastates the Beast. And I think Nicholas Holt gives a really great performance here. I think this is he's a good actor to begin with, but I'm saying I think this is his moment in all the X-Men films where he is sitting at the table after the funeral. And Charles, again, this is something that I thought could have been acted better by McAvoy. And again, this is nothing against McAvoy, but the part isn't written very well for Charles in this film. And I don't think, I mean, McAvoy could only rise to the occasion so much. So Beast pretty much puts the blame on Charles, because Beast is the one that convinced Raven to stay, and of course they were in love, and it seems like their relationship had progressed since the last film. So you have to imagine they'd been together for a couple of years at this point, and now Beast leaves the team and goes to find Jean himself. Now, what follows is my favorite part of the film. I think this was by far and away the best part of the film, where you actually saw Jean and Magneto together. Jean seeks out Magneto. And this was a very powerful part of the film. This is a part that I wish could have been expanded on had the runtime been longer. Had we actually allowed the storyline to breathe, this would have been a great scene to have either go on longer, or perhaps maybe a secondary scene of them two together. It also, it kind of begs the question how well Jean knows Magneto, because the last time they saw each other was 10 years ago, and it was only briefly, and it was only during, this great battle where there really wasn't no communication between them. So you have to fill in the blanks yet again. And and Fassbender's great here as well. I think this film really makes up for Apocalypse to him, because I felt like he was wasted in Apocalypse, Fassbender. In the same way, I think McAvoy's talent is wasted in this film. But McAvoy gets some good choice scenes here. He's asking her, whose blood is on your shirt? Whose blood is that? And he must ask her like 3 times, and she refuses to answer. Again, because we know what'll happen when she does. But he is the only one she seems to think that she can go to at this point, and it's understandable because he's got blood on his hands as well. In his mind, probably justifiable blood, but for the most part, Magneto, you know, does not care about the lives he takes. I mean, going so far back as Days of Future Past, when he was going to kill Mystique just for the salvation of their race, and one might say it's a little, now he's sort of on the warpath against Jean when he finds out that she killed Mystique. But you got to remember there is a lot of history between them two, Mystique and Magneto. I kind of believe, it's effective, but part of the problem also is Jean doesn't really kill anybody beyond Mystique in this film, and I didn't mind that initially because I kind of didn't want to have a replay of the last film and of the usual of the comic and the usual concept that she has to die because she killed so many. And they don't go that route here, but for the president and for Magneto and everyone to see her as this really, really dangerous threat, it seems like we only have the one instance, and it's the instance of killing Mystique. Again, I feel it. I understand it. I would imagine that this would send Beast off to act like this. I understand how Magneto feels about this. It's strong enough, but if you're looking for like a worldwide level threat, it's it could use a little more seasoning on it to make it a little more palatable. So anyhow, it's a great scene. Now, another problem around here is there is some obvious cut scenes or cut lines of dialogue. And Sophie Turner is amazing in this film. She's just excellent. And particularly in this scene with Magneto, she really kind of pours her heart out to him because she trusts him because he does have blood on his hands and how he got away from that and lived a life of peace. And she's still tormented by what she's done, what's inside her, what's, compelling her. Meanwhile, Cyclops, and again, it's in sort of a mirrored thing from The Last Stand. Storm is kind of like on the side of, well, we have to get her at all costs, same way she spoke to Wolverine. She's sort of having that take with Cyclops. Again, Storm doesn't really have a lot to do here. I think she had a better role here than she had in Apocalypse, but she's basically playing watered down Halle Berry. But again, the actress is good. I mean, I think it's not her fault that, to be honest with you, and I've always said this, so I'm not contradicting anything I've ever said before, but Storm is kind of a boring character. I know Claremont loved her and put her in a lot of stuff. There really isn't a lot of great Storm storylines. When you look at storylines from the X-Men, great stories were about Wolverine, Cyclops and Jean, X and Magneto, stuff like that. But you really didn't have a great Storm storyline. Again, another problem here is when Mystique dies. Again, it's a moot point now because the series is over. The Fox series is over, but they did never betray that she was Nightcrawler's mother. So again, Fox seems to, or at least they did, had every opportunity of doing over and touching on all the things that the first franchise didn't. And again, they let that one go by the wayside. And it's never known that, they even sort of, touched on in Apocalypse that, Pietro knows that Magneto's his father, but we don't even get an inkling of Mystique and Nightcrawler here. That's an aside, but again, kind of disappointing. All right, so talking about the cutscenes, in this scene in the trailer, Jean says it feels really good, and that scene is cut out. Then we also have a great scene between Cyclops and Professor X, where Cyclops is frantic about what's going on, and Charles says, "I don't know what to do," which was a great line and a great delivery, much better than I just delivered it. But these are things that I think would have enriched the story, and I don't know why it seems very much like they trimmed this to the bone, and I don't know who's at fault here. Is it Kinberg because he doesn't know what he's doing because he's a new director? Is the studio for interfering because they wanted a streamlined film? Is it Disney because they wanted to sabotage it? I mean, there's a lot of speculation I have as to why this film, because all the pieces are there, the building blocks are there. We've got great actors, we've got a great storyline, but it seems like there's like so much ineptitude that keeps it from taking off. Every single time I thought the film was going to ramp up, it peters out, it backs down, it sort of takes the easiest route around rather than going over the you know jumping over the shark, so to speak. It just sort of quietly putters along in the side. So yeah, so Jean ends up, the army comes to accost Magneto and Jean is about to destroy them, really, but Magneto saves them, which again is a switch for him, which I think is earned at this point, that he sort of has respect for humankind. Again, this is an interesting, parallel from uh, Last Stand, where I think Magneto treated Jean more like a weapon in Last Stand. In this film, he really doesn't have any kind of interest in her whatsoever. It's an interesting play. I think this works better because Jean comes to him. He really doesn't want to have anything to do with the outside world. She brings it to him, and then when he saves her from killing, basically, and saves the soldiers, she departs after he, rejects helping her. And so that kind of also spurs on her, her isolation. I think that was very good. Beast comes and spills the news to Eric, and now they're joining forces to take her out. Now we'll talk about one of the other things I said, which is probably one of the most lacking aspects of the film, which is Jessica Chastain's character, which is an alien. I don't think they particularly made the race widely known. I remember seeing the subtitles saying what the name of the race is. I don't know. Essentially, they're the Skrulls. And again, this was probably the reason Disney moved it down, because they didn't want shape-shifting aliens to be coming out before Captain Marvel. So these are essentially Skrulls, and Jessica Chastain is sort of the lead Skrull, for lack of a better term. I don't know what they were really called in the movie, but I'm calling them Skrulls. Essentially, that's what they were. And she kind of tries to take Jean under her wing to try to exploit her powers in a way similar to what Magneto did, but I think she essentially wants the powers for herself. Now, this is a place where the villains are very underwhelming. Essentially, they're shapeshifted into humans, and again, this spares the budget a lot. Which the budget is allegedly $200 million, not counting probably the promotional expense, but $200 million, and we see them as aliens so briefly. They just look like a guy with a suit and tie, a guy with a blazer or something. It's very underwhelming. It does feel very sci-fi channel. That's what I meant by that. And the only difference is Chastain has no eyelashes. An interesting choice. And I don't know, bleached eyebrows. And this was an opportunity that they could have. I don't know that necessarily that the Shi'ar Empire would have worked, but they could have used an element from the comics. The Shi'ar Empire, they could have made her Lilandra. They could have used the Hellfire Club. Now I know they used it in First Class, but of course, one would think that's a club, an organization that would have carried on and had other members and so forth. They might not have had the Emma Frost and Sebastian Shaw, but they could have probably made these aliens um, into mutants, into you know um, the Hellfire Club 2.0. It would have made it more interesting. Of course, Mastermind, I think, was the one who tried to sort of seduce Jean Grey in the first in the comics. So that was sort of an incarnation I thought we could have been seeing. In this case, she's very lifeless. And again, this is not really a jab at Chastain. She plays it as well as possible, but I mean the character itself is pretty lifeless. And I don't know. It just felt like they could have done something with the antagonist of the movie. I don't think Jean should have been the full villain because, like I said, I think in the comics she was also pretty much manipulated at some point by the Hellfire Club to bring out these darker impulses. All right, so let's see. So at this point, we have the standoff again, very similar to Last Stand, except at this point, uh, Charles and team are going to try to stop Magneto from killing Jean. And Cyclops, my boy Cyclops. A lot of people are making fun of the fact that they made him drop the F-bomb, and it didn't particularly work. I mean, I don't particularly like profanity anyway, so I mean, it didn't really matter to me. It seemed like a slightly more positive use of it since First Class. I think First Class with the Wolverine joke was that was amusing, but apart from that, they kind of feel like they just throw it in there just for the sake of having it in there. Ever since then. But Cyclops also gets the shaft in this film. Now, this is something also that disappointed me because you would think that, Wolverine got the focus in the original franchise run. And you would think this would be a great opportunity to give Cyclops his due. He's a leader. He's the one that Jean and they do pay some lip service to it. Jean says, I'm always going to come back to you," or whatever. He doesn't really get too much of the spotlight here. He basically just plays out whatever's happening beside Charles. He doesn't really have a strong voice or strong leadership role. And Ty Sheridan is great. I mean, I'm sure he could carry on, carry out whatever, storyline he had to. But for whatever reason, they still seem to sideline him very much in this film. As for Nightcrawler, uh, I was very disappointed with the way they treated him in the end. It was very strange where again, we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit there, but just to speak of the characters, a lot of them, it feels like they're acting out of character, but I think the greatest defense was Nightcrawler. He is supposed to be the religious one. And Alan Cumming played him very well in that respect. He was written very well. And even in Apocalypse, they showed him to be sort of a mild-mannered person with sort of a a religious affinity where he was praying. And at this point, he sees some guards that he's trying to protect be killed, and he sort of snaps and just starts killing like 3 or 4 aliens, putting one in front of a train, snapping another's neck with his tail. And it felt very out of character, and it just is put in the movie like willy-nilly. It was like, let's give Nightcrawler a scene, but let's give him a scene where he really freaks out and kills people. It's like, whose bright idea was that? Have you not ever read Nightcrawler in the comics? Have you never seen X2? This is not that character. I don't particularly understand why they did that. And a lot of people, I see a lot of people complaining about, well, this is not going to lead up well to the original films. You don't understand. These films are not supposed to lead up to the original films. This is a completely different timeline. They can change everything going forward here. So that's kind of disappointing too. But yeah, allegedly they are going to lead to eventually, you know, and McAvoy is supposed to become Stewart and so forth. But the characters acting out of character, that is not something that has to be addressed, and that's why it's a cheap cop out for them to do these kind of things when they don't really have to match up with what comes later. It's sad. All right, so next comes like the most is the most depraved scene probably of any X film, where Jean basically drags Charles up a flight of stairs by manipulating his feet and legs, uh, sort of just for her own amusement. And again, this is something that is kind of perverse, and I think it works in as much as it shows just how evil and depraved she's become. While at the same time, it does feel very perverse. And it's again, it's taking a chance here, which is a bit stranger than we might have seen before, but it does sell Jean being a lost soul at this point. And Chastain's alien, which I don't think ever gets a well, no, her name is what, Ver, something like that, almost Veers, Ver. She's sort of again egging her on. It's not even really addressed as well. Another like instance where they really didn't completely explain the situation, but apparently Ver kills Jean's father, and Jean doesn't really seem to be aware of it, despite having this great cosmic power or anything. And since she didn't kill him herself, the prevailing theory is that maybe she wouldn't want him killed, but she still seems to be listening to Ver, or if that's her name, I'm not even sure. We'll just say Chastain's character. I'll just carry on with that. But Professor X does end up reaching her and reminds her of their first meeting when he gave her the pen and all that great dialogue and stuff. And she does break free of it. So it's quite different. It was like at a point I was wondering if they were going to redo Last Stand in that respect, where she's going to kill him. The same thing with Magneto. I thought for a moment that she was actually going to kill Magneto, because Magneto ends up, of course, breaching the hotel or whatever she's in and is attempting to kill her. But again, there isn't really anything he can do. He's completely powerless. So the police capture them all, and this is where we get the final act, which a lot of people say this is the best scene in the movie. I think it was done pretty well, but it really, it's interesting because I think the small stakes of it were pretty interesting. It's basically just a train, and they basically have 2 cars to do the action, and they do a little on the top of the car, but it's kind of like a small set for this big action finish. And I don't know, I just feel like it felt like you could feel the rewrites. You could feel they kind of had to redo something, and they were like, this is what we're going to do. And even though it just feels like it was plopped into the movie, that's the way the movie's going to end. You know what I mean? It doesn't really feel as organic as it probably could. But the scenes, like I said, are pretty well CGI'd. There's some pretty good action. Magneto gets to do his thing again with pulling out a bunch of guns from the wall, and that was a lot of CGI on that. It was really good too, when he was blowing away Chastain's character, who of course still survived. The X-Men, the X-Men have the power nullifying collars, and the idea is that they have to try to convince the army to let them go so they can fight these aliens, and finally they do. And then Charles and Cyclops try to revive Jean, who's still unconscious. And Charles has this conversation with her in her mind when she's a little girl. Actually, in his mind, he says. And she revives. They end up going to some kind of junkyard setting similar to The Last Stand, where she takes out the rest of the villains. And in order to save everybody else's life, again, as I said, I was kind of concerned that we were just going to do the same thing, where maybe in this case she would be sacrificed and not necessarily have to be killed. But she sacrifices herself to some degree by taking Chastain's alien into the sky and disintegrating her up there. Um, this is the ending is what I didn't like. They could have ended it there and it would have been fine, but they end up Scott once again is like, you know, emotionally devastated. He ends up putting a plaque on the sign on the opening gates of the school, which is called the Jean Grey School for the Gifted, as they renamed it in honor of Jean. Um, then we have Professor X, who retires and gives the school over to Beast to control. Which again, Beast, he does have a moment when he says on the train something like, "Oh, this is what Mystique would have wanted," and he powers up again and joins the X-Men. So again, you can say that it feels out of character for him to behave as he does, wanting to kill Jean, and you'd be right, but I can kind of buy it. I can kind of see that, again, that's the strength of the story of the Dark Phoenix storyline, is there is different factions that are sort of, do we want to save her? Does she deserve to be saved? And there's the other fractions that are like, she's our friend, and she's not responsible for what she's doing. It's not her fault. And it's, there was so much more gold to be mined with that. But the little bit we get, I think, is rewarding enough. But I think, again, you've had two shots at this. How can you not dig deep at this point and just give us the full on experience and not fool around and with Jean's repressed powers and Professor X did it to protect her, he's wrong. So now Professor X is sort of self-punishing himself by retiring from the school, and sort of like, it's basically what it reminded me of was the Dark Knight Rises ending, where he's off in some cafe in France or something, and Magneto finds him. This was nice, though. I like ending the whole franchise on these two together. And it's tough to tell if they were setting this up as if there would be sequels, or if this was a reshot ending so that they could sort of put some finality on it. But Magneto brings the chessboard, and he's like, sort of convinces Charles to play one last game, and then he sort of invites Charles to come to his plantation or reservation or whatever you want to call his little annexed area of land. And I guess the implication being that Charles probably is going to take him up on the offer. And at the very end, we see the Phoenix in Firebird form flying over the sky, and Jean's narration says that she's evolved. And this to me sounds something like what I think Bryan Singer would have done with this, because I am curious as to what Bryan Singer would have done with this, even though obviously he's had his problems, and I think it's probably best that he doesn't, get involved with the X-Men franchise at this point. I'm not going to get into that, but I do remember his X3 that he wanted to do was supposed to be about the next stage of evolution. It was going to be sort of like the X-Men versus evolution itself, or something like that. And I think this is an interesting choice to let Jean live and evolve. It's an interesting choice. I'm not sure exactly what to make of that. Does that mean she's going to come back in human form at some point? Is she staying away for the sake of her family, friends, whatever you want to call them, for the danger she would possess? Is she just happy out there doing that more than being with Scott? It leaves a lot of unanswerable questions. And I don't know if that's sort of set up for another movie. That, of course, is not going to happen, but, or if that was just sort of the idea. Um, as far as wokeness, I'm trying to also think if maybe that is something that we don't want to kill Jean because, as I said, they really sort of trimmed her claws, so to speak, as the Phoenix. They didn't let her kill anybody. She really did no harm to anybody, but accidentally killing Mystique. So the idea is that she doesn't have to ultimately pay for what she's done. She doesn't have to have the punishment for it because obviously in the original comic she was going to survive in the original Claremont story. But Jim Shooter, who of course was the legendary editor in chief at that time, said, "Look, Jean destroyed an entire planet of people. You don't let Jean destroy an entire planet of people and then let her go on to, be an X-Man and be in love with Cyclops and everybody lives happily ever after." Of course, she came back eventually, and but you can't just sort of carry on without there being some consequences. And so she had to die. And in this case, they don't give her any consequences for what she's done because she really didn't hurt anybody else apart from, an accidental uh, death that's on her conscience, unfortunately. And again, like I said, Mystique. I don't think they really, to be honest with you, I think Mystique was. This is going to sound strange, but I think Mystique was a lot more effective in death than she was in life in the past two films. In this film and in the last film, there really isn't anything for her to do, but her death does spur on the events, and it kind of felt like she needed to be uh, it needed to happen because it felt very much. I mean, not only because Jennifer Lawrence kind of wanted out and was disinterested in the role, but the emotional ties to Eric, to Charles. We can think back. We don't even need to see any flashbacks because Charles kind of goes over the story again. Oh, I met Raven in that corner of the kitchen and this and that. And it does bring a level of pathos to the performance. Again, I kind of wish they would have played on the emotions a little bit more. But again, everything moved so darn fast. Nothing really had a chance to resonate as much as it should have. I mean, again, I'm not calling this a bad movie by any means. And we're going to wrap it up. And so, I have to put a point value on this one. Oh, also in the credits, I do want to mention they did do a tribute to Stan Lee. They shout out to Stan Lee. Of course, no cameo, but they said in memory of Stan Lee, which of course was very nice because of the this being the first Fox film, I believe, after his passing. So yeah, not a terrible film. That's the thing. There is some great, brilliant performances in this, and I think you owe it to yourself to watch it. But you have to have your expectations dialed to a reasonable level. Um, I think it's much better. See, I don't really judge the Fox X films against Deadpool because I haven't seen those movies, or I've seen a little bit of the first one. I wasn't crazy about it. I don't judge them against the Wolverine movies because I don't really think that that's quite in the same genre. It's about one hero, not necessarily. It's not quite the same. And even there, there are various levels of good and bad in the Wolverine films. I wasn't a big fan of Logan, to be totally honest. I did like Origins more than most people, although I admit it's really nothing special, but I think it's a good actioneer. And the Wolverine is somewhere in the middle. It's like it's not quite up there on the action. It's got a good action scene at the end, which is kind of people complain about that ending, but that's when the action actually comes out because most of the beginning of the film is not that action centric, but does have a pretty engaging story. But judging against the other X films, like I said, I think it's much better than Apocalypse. Certainly not as good as Days of Future Past. I'm not a huge fan of First Class. I think, like I said before, I think that's a really good film, but it's not in my top 10. I would say Days of Future Past is in my top 10. So I would put it probably on par with First Class in the reboot franchise. Going up against the other X-Men films. As I said, it's on par with Last Stand. I think it addresses a lot of the deficiencies of The Last Stand, but at the same time, it doesn't have as well-rounded a story as The Last Stand. You know what I mean? There's no um I don't know how to describe it, but like the trappings of The Last Stand make for a more completed movie. In this case, it feels very much like they could have actually gotten more emotional beats. They could have actually brought out something more. The villains were not that impressive, but the story of the Dark Phoenix herself was. So I don't know. It's sort of on par. I think I'd have to do a bunch of rewatches before I could really pinpoint which was better. But I think for the Dark Phoenix character herself, Dark Phoenix movie is better. For an overall presentation, probably The Last Stand is better. That's the way I'd look at it. But again, yeah, just to eulogize the Fox X-Men franchise again, they had more good films than they didn't. I mean, the first two X-Men films were outstanding. I mean, the first was obviously they were trying out something new. And I remember they said basically it was Bryan Singer making a trailer for what his real X-Men film would be, which was X2, which of course X2 I think is one of the greatest comic book films. Probably makes my top 10, although there's so many out now at this point. But that was a fantastic one. Days of Future Past, again, a fantastic movie from start to finish. First Class is great. And I think, does it go out with a whimper or a bang? Probably more so a whimper, but again, it's not a lot of people wanting to just bash this film as being bad, and that is too that's too easy a cop out. You know what I mean? It's not that easy to just say if it's good or bad. It feels like to me, it feels like there's a good maybe 30 minutes of this film missing that would probably make it better. If they do in fact have other scenes or another cut or just some deleted scenes maybe that they could put into it to sort of stretch out. Give us a little more Cyclops. Give us what Cyclops is going through emotionally with this. He doesn't get to react here any more than in The Last Stand or in X2. He gets about the same amount of screen time. Give us a little more time. Um, give us more Jean and Magneto. That would have been a great additional scene, or maybe they could have lengthened that scene somewhat by some of the additional lines that were apparently cut. Again, I think it would have been a much stronger performance. But again, as it stands, I think it's a decent film. It's a good film. I think I'm going to be more generous to it than most people. I'm going to give X-Men Dark Phoenix 4 stars out of 5. That's 4 stars out of 5. I very rarely go under that. So it's more, I think it's more descriptive if I give a letter rating. And I'm going to give Dark Phoenix, I'm going to say a B plus. I'm going to give it a B plus. I think a lot of people are giving it a C. I'm giving it the extra little, it's probably a B, I think, in all reality. I'm giving it the extra little oomph for out of respect for some great performances by Fassbender, Turner, and Holt particularly. On that basis, I'll give it a B plus and not just a B. But they can't all be masterpieces, I suppose. But it's really sad that after two shots at the target, they seem to still be missing the bullseye on the Dark Phoenix. So thank you for joining me once again. If you have any comments, please let me know in the comments below. What did you think of the Dark Phoenix? Are you sad to see the X-Men franchise leave Fox? In a way, I am. I've said this before, but I am not happy with the way the MCU has treated Spider-Man, and I don't think they're going to treat the X-Men any better. So to me, this is a sad ending. Like I said, the ending of this film wasn't totally satisfactory to me, but we did have a good run with these Fox characters. So let me know what you think about the Fox characters. Let me know what your ranking is for these films. You know, are you more inclined to say this was the better Dark Phoenix film or The Last Stand? I'm curious to know that because they are very much on par with one another. Make sure you hit that like button, smash that subscribe button. Make sure you share the video, and we will be with you again as soon as possible. We still got a lot more to talk about in the world of pop culture and our usual Saturday show. So until next we meet, this is Johnnie Torch reminding you once again, keep the flame burning brightly, and I'll be with you again real soon.